Hi, everybody. Welcome back. Gosh, it feels like forever since the three of us have been together, and it's good to have you all with us. I think it's been probably what? I don't know, 3 weeks?
Yeah, about that.
Yeah. So it's kind of nice to be reunited again. And as we continue and getting really closer to winding up the book of Acts, we're doing chapter 27 this week. Next week will be chapter 28, which is the conclusion of the book of Acts. So like I said last week, be thinking about what you would like to tackle next. And we'll do some talking and kind of looking on seeing what we might want to explore. One of the options I put out there was to maybe do one of the Gospels or something, if there's another Old Testament book or something that you'd be interested in. So be thinking about that. So chapter 27 of Acts. And I will just say this, if your Bible has a map, has maps in the back, it's helpful to have that, the map of, it's usually labeled as like Paul's missionary journeys, and it's got the maps usually in different colors of his 3 missionary journeys and then his final journey to Rome. It helped me make sense of kind of where everything was geographically here as we go through this chapter tonight. And I think that will help you as well. And I've kind of subtitled this this week's study as Storms and Shipwrecks. And I think it's kind of timely, maybe because, gosh, with all the news that we've had lately, storms, just really, we're praying for the people in the south part of the United States who are feeling the after effects of Hurricane Ida as that continues to make its way up, and all of the problems that they're dealing with. And also, just in some of the areas, for instance, and I shared this in church on Sunday, back in the area where I grew up, Northeast Iowa, Southeast Minnesota, and even South Central Minnesota, they had some really severe storms come through, lots of crop damage, lots of flooding going on. So just a lot of people dealing with that. And then of course, all of the things with our troop withdrawal from Afghanistan and everything that's happening in connection with that. So we are living in a stormy time for sure, literally and figuratively. All right, so let's begin with chapter 27. To give you a time frame on when this takes place, this was probably in mid-October. And I'll explain why I can be so specific on time of year there, in the year 59 AD. So we will go ahead and start reading chapter 27. Olivia, can you do 1 through 12, please?
Yep. When it was decided that we would sail for Italy, Paul and some other prisoners were handed over to a centurion named Julius, who belonged to the imperial regiment. We boarded a ship from
Adramyttium,
about to sail for ports along the coast of the province of Asia, and we put out to sea.
Aristarchus. I'm sorry, I should have looked to see how many bad words were here before I gave it to you to read.
Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica, was with us. The next day we landed at Sidon, and Julius, in kindness to Paul, allowed him to go to his friends so they might provide for his needs. From there we put out to sea again and passed to the lee of Cyprus because the winds were against us. When we had sailed across the open sea off the coast of, is it Cilicia or Cilicia?
Either one, I think I've heard it both ways.
Okay, and Pamphylia, we landed at Mysia. I'm just going for it.
Yeah.
There the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy and put us on board. We made slow headway for many days and had difficulty arriving off Cnidus. When the wind did not allow us to hold our course, we sailed to the lee of Crete opposite Samone. We moved along the coast with difficulty and came to a place called Fair Havens near the town of Lasea. Much time had been lost, and sailing had already become dangerous because by now it was after the fast. So Paul warned them, "Men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to ship and cargo, and to our own lives also." But the verb. But the centurion, instead of listening to what Paul said, followed the advice of the pilot and of the owner of the ship. Since the harbor was unsuitable to winter in, the majority decided that we should sail on, hoping to reach Phoenix and winter there. This was a harbor in Crete facing both southwest and northwest.
Okay, let's stop there and just kind of talk about a few things. First of all, we need to kind of talk a little bit about some of the characters involved here. Again, we've talked about this before, but not for a while. This is written in first person, and remember, Luke is the author here. So we can assume now that Luke is traveling with Paul. Why they allowed that, I don't know, because technically Paul is a prisoner. He's being taken to Rome. But regardless, Luke is traveling with him, as well as this guy named Aristarchus. And he was a person that they met in Thessalonica earlier in the book of Acts. And I'm sorry, I didn't write down which chapter that was in, but we've seen Aristarchus before. So Aristarchus and Luke are both traveling with Paul. The other person that I think it's kind of interesting to note, because he'll figure kind of heavily here in the narrative, is the centurion named Julius. And it's interesting that Luke names him. A lot of times when Luke has been narrating or talking about these, you know, the Roman officials and things like that, he hasn't given them names, but for some reason, he feels it's important to name Julius. I think that the reason why, and we see this in Julius's behavior as we go on in the narrative here, I think Julius either already was or became, as a result of this trip, a Christian. I think he became a believer. And so I think that's why Luke feels it's important to note his name and who he is. Remember, Luke's whole objective here is to give a historical account. The other thing is, remember, I told you that the time of this is probably mid-October. And the reason we know that is given to us in verse 9, when it says, much time had been lost and sailing had already become dangerous because by now it was after the fast. If many of your Bibles might not word it this way, but if they do have that word, the fast, and fast is capitalized, most of them have a footnote, as mine does. So if you go and look at that footnote, that is the Day of Atonement, or Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur was a high holy day for the Jewish people. In fact, the most holy day of the year. The Day of Atonement was the day that the sins of the Jewish people were dealt with in this ritual. And so that was accompanied by fasting also. It was required that you would fast because of that. So it makes sense that they would have delayed leaving until after the Day of Atonement, after Yom Kippur, because this is a highly, heavily Jewish population. And of course, they're going to continue to observe these religious holidays. So usually Yom Kippur happens sometime in the fall, usually in October, thereabouts. So we can kind of guess and look, and I suppose we could research, go back that many years to look and see exactly what date Yom Kippur fell on in that year. But we're looking at about mid-October. So winter is coming on. And so that figures in pretty prominently now into the story, because winter is not going to be a time that they're going to be wanting to travel on the sea. They put it off as long as they can.
Why?
Because usually in the wintertime, then the winds kind of shift and it becomes much more dangerous. So for people in the Gulf of Mexico area, summertime, I mean, this time is difficult. It's hurricane season. In that region of the world, of course, this isn't an area of hurricanes because it's not an ocean, not an open ocean. But they would have the same kind of risk dealing with like winter storms and things like that.
Okay.
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 So they're pushing it really as late as they can. And Paul is advising them to not go. I mean, at this point, they are in Fair Haven, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
And if you look on your map, it kind of helps to look there on your map. Fair Havens is on the island of Crete. It's a port like on the south. And they're hoping that they can kind of sail around the southern part of Crete and winter in Phoenix, which is on more of the western side. And if you look on your map, it really doesn't look that far away. So it's kind of interesting how, as we continue in the story here, how quickly things can take a bad turn. So they're not really wanting to go far to be able to winter over. And Paul cautions against this. Now, why does Paul do that? Paul's not a sailor. We can assume then that Paul is cautioning against traveling because he has kind of the advantage of prophecy or some kind of knowledge that he's received a word from God. Regardless, they don't listen to Paul. And I guess, you know, at first when I was reading this, I was like, why didn't they listen to him? But then I got to thinking, why would they? Paul's not an expert seaman. He's not a captain. He's not a sailor. I mean, this is not his career or anything else. So the people who are making those decisions are listening to the experts, right? To make their decision and get information to base their decision on. But that, I think, kind of figures then as we go further into our discussion here, and just kind of keep this in mind. What experts do we listen to? It's kind of a question that we have to kind of wrestle with when we have difficult things like this come up. All right, Carolyn, can you pick up at verse 13 and read down through 26, please?
When a gentle south wind began to blow, they thought they had obtained what they wanted. So they weighed anchor and sailed along the shore of Crete. Before very long, a wind of hurricane force called the northeaster swept down from the island. The ship was caught by the storm and could not head into the wind. So we gave way to it and were driven along. As we passed to the lee of a small island called Cauda, we were hardly able to make the lifeboat secure. When the men had hoisted it aboard, they passed ropes under the ship itself to hold it together. Fearing that they would run aground on the sandbars of Syrtis, they lowered the sea anchor and let the ship be driven along. We took such a violent battering from the storm that the next day they began to throw the cargo overboard. On the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days and the storm continued raging, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. After the men had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them and said, "Men, you should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete. Then you would have spared yourselves this damage and loss. But now I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost, only the ship will be destroyed. Last night, an angel of the God, whose I am and whom I serve, stood beside me and said, 'Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island.'"
Okay. All right. So couple of things that I just kind of was looking in. I looked at a couple of different commentaries and then just kind of some different research. You know me, I go down these rabbit holes. And I found out a little bit about the kind of ship that they were on. So we're told that it was a ship from Alexandria. It was a grain ship. It's an Alexandrian ship, and that would mean that this ship was loaded with grain, probably wheat, from Egypt, and it was bound for Rome. It was going to be carrying wheat to Rome. And so the way these ships were, they were big cargo ships, and they had kind of a unique shape. And one of the pieces of information that I found, it was kind of interesting to think about this. Most of those kinds of ships were about 140 feet long and about 36 feet wide. And of course, they didn't have engines or anything. So they relied on, for some ships, they relied on like rowing or oars or sails. This particular type of ship didn't have oars because the bottom would be filled with the grain. But it had like two oars kind of like by the back, I think, to kind of help steer it. It depended on a large square sail. And because of that, it would not be a ship that would sail into the wind really easy. So it's a sail that's going to depend on being pushed from behind. So this is why we're told that, you know, they got the southern wind, and that's what they wanted, was something that's coming from the south. Because again, looking on your map, you're going to see that they have to kind of go to the northwest to be able to make it to Italy. And so they want the southern wind. But once they come around, kind of they're not protected anymore by Crete and by the kind of southern part of Greece, then they get hit with this wind from the northeast. And so that pushes them further south, almost then back down to like Northern Africa is where they end up. It's a part of the sea that they call the Adriatic. It's the Mediterranean Sea, but it's the part that they call the Adriatic, which is in kind of the central part of the Mediterranean Sea. It's between Italy and Crete and Africa. So that's kind of where they're at here. And so the wind is driving them. And the other thing that we're told is that there were several days where there was no sun and then no stars. That's what they depended on for navigation, to figure out what direction they were going in. So if you don't have the sun to figure out what direction you're going in, and you don't have the stars at night to navigate, then essentially these people are pretty much at the mercy of the sea. They're just being taken wherever the sea is tossing them. And things get to the point where they're trying to lighten the load. First of all, we're told that they pass ropes kind of under the ship to try and kind of like hold it together. So the storm is bad enough that they're afraid that the ship is going to break apart. And so they're kind of trying to batten down the hatches, so to speak. But then they lower the anchors because they're trying to kind of get themselves where they can at least stay someplace or slow things down a bit. And then they start throwing cargo overboard. Now, the cargo is not the grain that they're throwing overboard. This is just regular cargo, probably that is maybe like up on the top or something like that. That doesn't help. And so then they start throwing over the ship's tackle. Tackle is not like fishing gear. It's things that are necessary for the ship to run. So they're really getting desperate here. They're throwing everything that they can think of overboard. But the thing that is interesting now here, as we get to kind of the end of this section that Carolyn read, is that Paul stands up and you almost expect him, and he kind of does start out, you should have listened to me. You almost kind of expect this, I told you so speech, and now because you didn't listen to me, you're all going to suffer. But that's not what he gives them. He gives them this kind of encouraging word that God came to him the night before, and I want you to have courage. So God comes to him and essentially kind of provides Paul and the others on the ship with some anchors to hold on to. First of all, God's presence is an anchor. God is there with Paul. And Paul words this very interestingly. He says, last night, an angel of the God whose I am and whom I serve. So that's another anchor, this sense of ownership and belonging. Paul belongs to God, and he has this sense of ownership. Ownership isn't maybe the word that I want here. I'm trying to think of maybe a better word. This bond, this belonging, this sense of family, and he knows that God's got him. So God comes to him, he gets God's presence, he gets God's sense of kind of belonging and encouragement, and then also promises. God says to him, don't be afraid, you must stand trial before Caesar. In order to stand trial before Caesar, he's got to be in Rome. So it's a promise here, you're going to make it to Rome. And also everybody with you. So God's promising not only Paul's safety, but the safety of everyone on the boat. It's an amazing promise that he gets. And so Paul's sharing this and he's saying, keep up your courage because I have faith in God and it will happen just as he told me. So the anchors that Paul gets and is sharing are the anchors of his faith and trust, the anchors of God's promises and God's presence. Any other comments or?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Because when it starts on verse 21, it said after the men had gone a long time without food. Is that because they were getting seasick or?
Probably. Yeah. I'm guessing it's probably because they were seasick, because what's being described here is pretty violent storm. I don't know if you've ever been on a boat when you got seasick. It's the absolute.
It's not pleasant.
No, it isn't.
I can't point my finger the right way. He's like, been on a boat with mom.
Yeah. When we went whale watching in off Hawaii, and that was awful. Yeah.
I have two questions relating to this little snippet. One, what does throwing the cargo overboard do?
It lightens the ship.
Wouldn't you want it heavier if you're trying to stay in one place?
You would think, except if it's heavier, it's also at danger of sinking. So if you can
Oh.
lighten it, it's going to be able to stay on top of the waves and ride the waves better.
Oh, okay. And then two, is there a definition for run aground?
Well, I guess the definition would be, that they would just essentially kind of like crash onto land, be like dashed up onto the
Oh.
shore. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm guessing that the reason that this sounds kind of like dangerous is that maybe the area that they would have been traveling in, being run aground, would not be a good thing. Maybe there were a lot of like rocky cliffs or something. So to be run aground in that area would not be a good thing.
But if you go by the map, they end up on Malta, it looks like. So
Yeah. Yeah.
shores are like,
Yeah. So you can see that if you go by the map, you can see that they have quite a detour here. All right, I'm going to finish out the chapter. I'm going to start at verse 27. On the 14th night, we were still being driven across the Adriatic Sea. This is that Adriatic that I mentioned earlier here. When about midnight, the sailors sensed they were approaching land. They took soundings and found that the water was 120 feet deep. A short time later, they took soundings again and found it was 90 feet deep. Fearing that we would be dashed against the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for daylight. In an attempt to escape from the ship, the sailors let the lifeboat down into the sea, pretending they were going to lower some anchors from the bow. Then Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, "Unless these men stay with the ship, you cannot be saved." So the soldiers cut the ropes that held the lifeboat and let it fall away. Just before dawn, Paul urged them all to eat. For the last 14 days, he said, you have been in constant suspense and have gone without food. You haven't eaten anything. Now I urge you to take some food. You need it to survive. Not one of you will lose a single hair from his head. After he said this, he took some bread and gave thanks to God in front of them all. Then he broke it and began to eat. They were all encouraged and ate some food themselves. Altogether, there were 276 of us on board. When they had eaten as much as they wanted, they lightened the ship by throwing the grain into the sea. When daylight came, they did not recognize the land, but they saw a bay with a sandy beach where they decided to run the ship aground if they could. Cutting loose the anchors, they left them in the sea and at the same time untied the ropes that held the rudders. Then they hoisted the foresail to the wind and made for the beach. But the ship struck a sandbar and ran aground. The bow stuck fast and would not move. Maybe it's the bow stuck fast and would not move. And the stern was broken to pieces by the pounding of the surf. The soldiers planned to kill the prisoners to prevent any of them from swimming away and escaping. But the centurion wanted to spare Paul's life and kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and get to land. The rest were to get there on planks or on pieces of the ship. In this way, everyone reached land in safety.
he's really testing us with this knowledge of ships. Like,
I know. That's why I decided that I needed to look it up because it helped me to make sense of what was happening here. So I'll kind of try and tell you a little bit kind of what I found out. So when they take soundings, they apparently had some sort of equipment that they could do to figure out what their depth was. They sense that they're coming close to land. Probably it smells differently, or maybe they're seeing like birds or hearing birds or things like that. I'm not sure what's kind of tipping them off, but they know that they're getting close to land.
Yeah,
ahead.
there's a Bible about it. It says that sailors can sense they're approaching land long before they see it because of an acutely developed sense of smell and by the sound of the waves. How they
Yeah, that's cool. Okay. So
Cool.
they're trying to figure out how close they're getting and how deep it is. And so they find out, that they're definitely getting closer to land because it's getting shallower. First it's 120 and then it's 90. So they're getting a little bit worried now that they're going to be dashed up against some rocks. So they drop the anchors and pray for daylight. So the anchors, they're wanting to just kind of slow themselves down and maybe try and change course. And so then some of the sailors think, well, we're going to abandon ship here. And so they think that they're going to, like they're pretending that they're going to lower some more anchors, but really what they're doing is they're thinking that they're going to get onto the lifeboat, but Paul is onto them and he's like, no, wait a minute, they can't do that, because if they do that, then we won't all be saved. So the soldiers then cut the ropes that hold the lifeboat and don't let them escape. And then we have this little kind of interesting little interlude here that Paul encourages them to eat. So they've gone all this time for 14 days without eating, more than likely because they're terribly seasick. We can kind of assume that maybe things are calming down a little bit, but I also found it kind of interesting, this kind of pattern that we see with the eating. He says, I want you to eat. You need it to survive. And then the ritual that he goes into reminds me a lot of communion. I don't know if that spoke to you guys as well.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I what he was doing was giving communion to everyone.
Yeah, that's kind of how I read it too. And I wasn't able to find anything in any of the commentaries that said that directly. So I don't know, but boy, it just really sounds like it. And then also Paul's kind of words to them before, you need this to survive. So I kind of also, as I'm kind of maybe reading in between the lines here, is that maybe there's been some conversion that's been going on here throughout this whole experience, and that Paul's been sharing the gospel. That's why I think that Julius, the centurion, is a Christian. Just because there's all this stuff that's happening. And so did they share the Lord's Supper then before they land?
I would think so, because what else are you going to do if you're sitting there on a boat for 2 weeks and you're going to tell me that not one person, after hearing Paul's speech about an angel, not one person is like, well, what do you mean?
Yeah.
Highly improbable. If there are 276 of them, that's highly unlikely. So I'm sure.
Yeah. All right. So that happens. And then daylight comes, they don't recognize the land. So these are experienced sailors. They know what things kind of look like. They probably run this route many times. They don't recognize where they are, but they did see a bay with a sandy beach. So this is a safe place to land, and they want to be able to try and kind of control the ship and run it aground. And so they cut off the anchors that's slowing them down. But then they also dump the grain. Now, the grain is the last thing to go. And the reason this is important is because up until this point, they have not been dumping any of the grain because the grain is the money. This is the cash. This is the whole reason for this ship. If they dump the grain, they lose out on a lot of money. But finally, they're at the point where, like, you know, we need to get rid of this. And so that brings the ship up higher then once they dump all that grain. And then they untie the ropes that hold the rudders. So now they're able to use these steering rudders to try and steer their way in. They hoist up the sail and they're trying to move that as well. Things are going fine until the ship hits a sandbar. And remember, Paul said back earlier when he tells them that there's not going to be any loss of life. This is back in verse
26.
Yeah, thanks. We must run aground on some island. And then, but he also says too that the ship's not gonna make it. There's gonna be, the ship is gonna break apart. So that's exactly what happens. And the ship breaks apart on this sandbar. And the soldiers are nervous now because they've got these prisoners, not just Paul, but there's other prisoners. And the soldiers are worried if they lose the prisoners, that means they lose their lives. But the centurion, who's the highest ranking official, they're planning on killing all the prisoners because they would rather kill them than be killed themselves for losing them. The centurion's like, no, nobody's going to get killed here. Nobody's dying. And he tells everybody to swim for shore, grab what you can, make it to shore. And so they all reach the land safely. All right. And then if you just kind of take a peek here at the beginning of chapter 28, we're told that they land on an island called Malta. So you can look and see where Malta is. Malta is just to the south of Sicily, which is just off of the toe of the boot of Italy. So they're close. All right. Questions or comments on this?
What I'm looking at the map, and you said that this is out of their way for their usual traveling distance. Where would they go? Because this would seem to me this would be the route you would take.
I wonder if they tried to stay closer to the coastline.
Yeah,
almost.
yeah. That's pretty much what they would do. They would stay close and more than likely maybe would have offloaded some of the grain as they kind of traveled. I mean, they leave from Caesarea. But that's not the grain ship. The grain ship they pick up in Salmone, which is on the far eastern side of Crete. And then they go to Fair Havens, which is kind of on that southern side of Crete. And their intent was to go to Phoenix and winter over. And then my guess is from Phoenix, then they would have maybe sailed up along the side of like Greece and stuff there to Italy.
Sorry, I'm terrible at geography. Greece is Macedonia on this map, right? Along that, on that side.
It'd be up just to the north of that of the island of Crete. You would see Sparta and Athens are some of the cities there.
My map doesn't touch.
Oh,
So-
okay.
They wouldn't plan to go originally around Sicily to get to Rome that way. They would have gone up into the Adriatic Sea and traveled across the land, or whatever you want to call it, of Italy to get to Rome.
Yeah, probably would have gone directly across the Adriatic, or on my map, it calls it the Ionian Sea. Down
Yeah,
between, yeah, down in between like the toe of the boot and the island of Sicily, which is actually what they ended up doing from Malta. Up to-
oh, there is a way to get through there. Cause I was like, are they gonna go all the way up into there and then go, do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, the map. The map. Going, so you're saying
Super
they wouldn't have
helpful.
gone this way? They would have gone this, like, up over here, down in through here.
Probably.
Oh,
Just
okay.
be able to stay closer to land.
Oh, so they wouldn't have gone
Easier to-
around.
No, it's easier to navigate if you can stay closer to land.
Oh, okay.
Plus the sea is going to be probably not as stormy.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah. All right. So a couple good takeaways, I think, from this lesson. Number one, when life gets stormy, and it does, remember that God is providing some anchors for us. His presence, his promises, his relationship with us, and our faith in him. That's what we need to hang on to and kind of be in tune with listening to those things that God is saying to us, those little voices that are kind of going off in the back of our heads or going on inside of us. That's really helpful. And the other thing that I kind of took away from this is that even when the stormy stuff is going on, it's still a good opportunity to be able to witness to Christ, because I'm pretty sure that's what Paul was doing throughout all of this. I think he made the most of that opportunity, and he's very concerned about all of the people who were on the ship with him. He could have very easily, I mean, that's the other thing that kind of strikes me. He could have very easily escaped. I mean, there were a couple of opportunities where he had to be able to escape, but he's trusting that God is going to get him to Rome to be able to share the gospel in Rome. And so he's doing what he can with the opportunities that he's given to be able to share the gospel. Any other thoughts or? Okay, let's close our time in prayer. Gracious God, we thank you that during the storms of our life, and there seem to be a lot of them right now, Lord, that you are always faithful to your promises to be with us, that you never leave us, you never forsake us. And that no matter what's going on and what's happening, that you have all of this under control and you have a greater plan. You have a goal in mind. Help us to trust that plan and to trust that goal and to trust the fact that you will bring us there in your time. And along the way, Lord, you provide us with opportunities to be able to witness to your love and your grace and your mercy. Lord, we pray for those who are in need of your presence this night, those who are dealing with devastating storm damage, those who are dealing with fear or illness, those who are grieving, those who are afraid. We ask that you be with all of us and give us what we need, the calming presence of your very self. Help us to have a good week. Show us opportunities each day to share the gospel. We pray this in Jesus' holy and precious name. Amen. Okay, thanks, everybody. You have a great week, and we will see you next week for the conclusion of the book of Acts. Like I said, be thinking about where you want to go next and let me know. Have a good week. We'll talk to you soon.
Bye.